Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to learn how to implement the generic repository pattern in AS.NET Core. If you're new to my channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated on .NET tutorials. First, let's quickly understand what a repository pattern is. Essentially, it's a way to encapsulate the logic required to access data sources. Instead of writing repetitive data access code, you can use a repository to handle these operations. If you didn't watch my previous video about implementing the repository pattern with a minimal API in .NET 9, you can check it out above. I'll also put a link in the description. Now in this video, we're going to take that same project and refactor it to implement the generic repository pattern. Let's get started. Now you might be wondering, why even bother with the generic repository pattern? Well, let me break it down for you. First, let's take a look at these two repositories, product and customer repository. Now both of these repositories are responsible for the same thing. Basic CRUD operations: create, read, update, delete. The only thing that's different between them is the entity they're working with. The product repository handles the product entity, and the customer repository handles the customer entity. Let's take a look at their implementations. As you can see, both repositories are almost identical. The same CRUD methods written out for each repository, which is where the problem of code duplication starts. When you're writing the same logic for different entities over and over, it's not just redundant, it's also a pain to maintain. For instance, if we wanted to add a new repository, say, a category repository, guess what? We'd have to copy and paste these same CRUD methods again. This is where the generic repository pattern comes in handy to reduce redundancy. The generic repository pattern allows us to create a single, reusable repository class that can handle CRUD operations for any entity type. This means less code duplication and a more maintainable codebase. Let's see how we can implement generic repository pattern. I'll start by creating a generic repository interface. I'll name this as iRepository. In this interface, I'm going to define the basic CRUD operations for our entities. We'll begin by adding the addAsync method. Let's define the tEntity type, which means we'll be specifying the type at runtime. And where tEntity is class. This add method takes two parameters: the entity you want to add, and a cancellation token for managing the operation's cancellation if needed. Let's add updateAsync method and removeAsync method. Add getByIdAsync method. This method takes an ID and a cancellation token as parameters and returns an entity if found or null if not. Let's add getAllAsync method, and this returns collection of entities. Alright, let's go ahead and implement the generic repository class. I'm going to name this class as repository, and it will inherit from the iRepository interface. Here also where tEntity class. Let's implement iRepository here. First, let's move the repository class to a separate file. Now let's go ahead and add the code for the addAsync method. First, I inject productDB context. Set tEntity.add. Mark method as async. I will implement remove method. First method mark as async. And change products as setTEntity. Now implement the updateAsync method. Change remove to update. And make method as async. Now let's implement getById method. Let's implement getAllAsync method. Great! Now that we've finished implementing our generic repository class, we can start using it in our endpoints. In here we can inject our repository product instead of product repository. I'm going to change the other endpoints to use iRepository product instead of product repository. I'm going to rename removeAsync method to deleteAsync. Let's inject iRepository customer instead of customer repository into customer endpoints. Alright, let's go ahead and run the application. I've set up all the endpoints in Postman. First, let's run the getAll endpoint for customers. So we're getting a 500 internal server error. Let's take a look and figure out what's causing the issue. The issue is that we haven't registered our repository yet. Let's go ahead and get that set up now. Let's rerun the application. Let's run the getAll customer endpoint again. Great! We can now see the customers. Alright, let's run the getAll endpoint for products. Awesome! The products endpoint is working perfectly now. Everything's looking great. Let's create a new customer. Everything's looking great. And that's how we implement the generic repository pattern. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. Also, if you have any questions or suggestions for future topics, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Happy coding!